Getting in the mood? A couple of more suggestions of things that you might not always do. One is called Kilo Na'eh. Anybody know that one? Oh, see? All right. Little education tonight. Kilo Na'eh, Kilo Ya'eh. Adir bimlucha, bimlucha, Bachur kehalacha, kehalacha, Gedolav yomru lo, Lecha ulecha lecha, Ki lecha lecha, Af lecha lecha, Adonai hamamlacha, Kilo na'eh, Kilo ya'eh. Of course, there are lots and lots of verses of that. How about two more? Who knows? Sorry, I don't need that. Yeah, I'm fine. Adirhu, Yivnei beito bekarov, Bimheira, Beyameinu bekarov, El bnei beitcha bekarov. And finally, this is one my daughter likes to do all the verses of. Do you? We won't do them all tonight. Echad mi yodea, Echad ani yodea, Echad Eloheinu, Sheva shamayim uva'aretz. Let's do Shnayim. Here we go. Shnayim mi yodea, Shnayim ani yodea, Shnei l'chot habrit, Echad Eloheinu, Sheva shamayim uva'aretz. Last verse. Shlosha mi yodea, Shlosha ani yodea, Shlosha avot, L'chot habrit, Echad Eloheinu, Sheba shamayim uva'aretz. Chag Sameach, everyone. Which, Entevi? No. Was it good? Whoop. Oh, that song?
Yeah, it's actually more than that. It's that song. The movie is a revisionist version of the Entebbe raid, right? So the song that they're doing is not exactly that song. But the song that they're doing in the movie is a dance performance done by the Batsheva dance troupe, which we actually saw when it first came out. We were on a trip. We're going to pass these out. There's two sheets. One says, Rabbi Feinstein's official tips for a better Seder. I'm coming. And the other says the master narrative, okay? So get one of each.
I'll help you.
Okay? All right, Louise, I'll give you so you and trust me. So the Batsheva dance troupe, which is the leading modern dance group in Israel, did a version of that song. And the two things that made it remarkable is that the version of the music that they played is a sort of, it's not a heavy metal thing, but it's with a big drum beat. And it's almost a recitation of the song behind a big drum beat. But the radical thing about the thing is that the dancers come in dressed in a sort of Hasidic garb. And over the course of the song, they undress until they're wearing nothing but tefillin. And they're men and women. And they're wearing nothing but leather straps strategically placed. And I was sitting, this is on television, so I got to be careful about this. I was sitting with Harvey Culber, who is a dear friend and a sweetheart. And Harvey and I are watching this, and it had just come out. No one had seen it. And the two of us are watching this together, and there are these very lovely young women writhing on the stage wearing nothing but tiny fill-in straps. And we both said, this is a religion we could believe in. I mean, you know. So for the rest of the trip, whenever there was a moment free, we would bang on the table wherever we were and start singing, Echad mi yodea, and take our clothes off. It was a wonderful trip. Yeah, Vakasha. What's the dance related to the movie? I haven't seen the movie. I've only read the reviews of the movie. There are good reviews and bad reviews of the movie. Apparently the notion is, first of all, it's a revisionist story and it's a revisionist dance. You know, it's a new way of doing something old and a new way of telling a story that's been told a lot of times before. I think it captures the sort of rawness and rhythm of the event. Yeah, it's a raw thing. I mean, it's a story of redemption, but it's a raw redemption. There's a great deal of violence in this redemption. Look, that's one guy's interpretation. So Verves. You know, if you go see the movie and tell me have you seen the film yet? Oh, what did you think of it? Was it good? Yeah. If you're Jewish, it's a good film. Really? If you're Palestinian, not so much. Is that? Yeah. Haaretz liked it. Jerusalem Post, the Haaretz didn't like it. Jerusalem Post actually liked it. It was the opposite of what I thought it would be. And the NPR didn't like it at all, huh? No. Oh, well. Yeah. Do we have any more of the sheets? Did everybody get one? Let me have one of the 10 tips sheets back so I don't remember. Okay, so tonight, let's go through this together. We're going to start with very practical stuff and work our way toward very abstract. So you're welcome to share this. Let's begin with a simple observation. There's an Israeli historian named Yuval Harari who wrote a couple of really interesting books lately. His first one was called Sapiens, and it's a one-volume cultural history of humanity. And in the opening chapter, he makes a very interesting observation. He says, chimpanzees, just like humans, form tribes. But a chimpanzee tribe can be no more than 19 members, because 19 happens to be the mathematical number of how many face-to-face relationships you can have and still maintain a certain sense of cohesion in a tribe. So a pod of chimpanzees will never grow to more than 19. Human beings developed something which enables us to grow bigger than 19. We developed language. And because we can share ideas through language, we can develop human communities, tribes, families, clans, tribes, communities, nations. We can develop connections with each other that are more abstract and therefore much, much bigger. A community is gathered around a story, a narrative. A narrative communicates its core values, its background, its aspirations for the future, its sense of duty, what we're obligated to do as human beings. A core narrative tells us who we are. Stories are very much an important part of human identity, personal identity and collective identity. If I'd ask you how you got here tonight, you tell me a story. If I ask you why you came here tonight, you tell me a better story. If we turned to each other, we would share stories and we would find certain commonalities among those stories and certain differences. And those commonalities and differences make this an interesting community. What we're about to do at Pesach is to share the master narrative, the master story for the Jewish people. The Mishnah teaches, B'chol dor v'dor chayav adam lirot et atzmo kilu hu yatsa b'Mitzrayim. In every generation, each one of us has to say, I came out of Egypt. That's the beginning of the CV, of a resume, of an autobiography of any Jew. Before you tell me who your parents were, before you tell me where you went to high school, before you tell me how you chose your profession, before you tell me how you entered your family, before you tell me anything, the first thing you're going to tell me is you got to know this about me. I was a slave and I was free. Those two facts shape everything Jewish. In a certain way, everything Jewish derives from those two facts. I was a slave, and that impressed upon me a certain set of sensibilities, a certain way of looking at the world, a certain way of thinking about myself, a certain way of understanding how I move in the world, and I was freed. I saw liberation. I saw it with my own eyes. That yields a theology, a way of thinking about God, a sense of God in the world and God in my life, a sense of how the world works and where I fit into it. This is the beginning of Jewishness. So everything that's authentically Jewish flows from this story, and this holiday is the holiday of sharing the story. Now, we share this story in many ways. It's shared every single day in our morning prayers. It's shared when we make Shabbat. We say, Zecher l'tziat Mitzrayim. It's shared when you put on tefillin. It's shared over and over again, but this is the holiday where we really share the story. And the effect of the holiday is remarkable, because what you're told to do is not just remember it, not just commemorate it, not just bring it up as a topic of familial conversation, but to make collective history into personal memory. I was a slave in the land of Egypt. Right? Over and over again, you're going to be told, turn to your child and say, Ba'avur zeh shasali Adonai b'tzeiti min Mitzrayim. The reason we're doing all this tonight is because of what God did for me when I came out of Egypt. It's always first person singular. This is what attaches you to the collective. And everything that we're going to do in this Seder is about attaching this from the collective to the personal, from the historical to the personal memory. That's what the holiday is really all about. That's why it's such an interesting holiday and such a powerful holiday. Its deepest theme is universal, because the human dream of moving from slavery to freedom, the human dream of freedom, is deeply ingrained in human beings. Certainly deeply ingrained, let's say, in Western culture. Okay? Then at the same time, there's all sorts of really troubling parts of the story. Really troubling parts of the story. You know, why do you got to smash the Egyptians? Why does the story of your liberation have to include a villain? You know, and why are there innocent bystanders in this story? I mean, so that's one set of issues. Then there's a deeply problematic theological problem in this story, which I'll admit at the big outset, which is the purpose of the whole story is to teach you that there's a God who is revealed to us in history. And for most of Jewish history, for most of Jewish experience, we believed in a God of history, even at the worst of times. I mean, how did Jews get through the Middle Ages? Not the Middle Ages meaning you're 60, but the Middle Ages, you know, from the exile, all the years of wandering and persecution and expulsion and inquisition, because they always believed that they were subject to a God of history who was going to remember them one day and redeem them. A God of history is a central part of the Jewish narrative up until 1942. And in 1942, with the construction of the Auschwitz concentration camp, it becomes impossible to believe in a God of history. You don't hear rabbis admit this very often. So to take this for what it's worth. You know, the idea is that the last generation, we've had a very difficult time making Pesach, because exactly the lessons of the holiday are the lessons that we agonize over in the 20th century. How do you believe in a God of history knowing what happens at Auschwitz? And so what you do, you know, you fudge it, you talk about liberation, other kinds of things. I'm good at that. All rabbis are good at that. All families are good. But this really is one of the core questions of the narrative. And if you remember Rabbi Schulweis in his teaching, a lot of his teaching was trying to reconcile these two things. How do I embrace a Jewish idea of God and at the same time embrace the events of my moment and not ignore the events nor ignore the imperative of Jewish history? What do I do with a God of history? So Schulweis's move, which is also the move of Yitz Greenberg, who was our guest last year, and other great theologians of the 20th century, is to simply say, we become the God of history. The God of history becomes a God of personal responsibility. And that's one of the ways of solving the problem, at least temporarily. But this is going to come up at your Seder table if you have wise, courageous children coming to your Seder table. So this is what the whole story is about. The purpose of the Passover is to tell a story. The story was told in all sorts of different ways, but beginning in the first century, around the year 100, the rabbis of the Mishnah gave us an ordered way of doing it, which we call the Seder. They took the form of the Seder from the Greco-Roman philosophical symposium. The Greek symposium has 4 cups of wine. The Greek symposium begins with a salad. The Greek symposium has a sweet relish that you get to eat after you finish the lesson. The Greek symposium has a mnemonic at the end of the proceedings where you remember what you learned by doing a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That is, key elements of the Seder were taken from an outside culture. Footnote. This is the typical Jewish pattern, right? This idea of assimilation as a curse is only a modern phenomenon. Most of the time, we borrowed heavily from the outside culture. So in this case, we borrowed heavily, well, first of all, you know that because whatever foods you're eating that are quote-unquote traditional foods were not Jewish foods, right? Right? I guarantee you what Rami's Iraqi mother cooks is different than what my Lithuanian mother cooked, right? He has spicy, delicious, colorful, Sephardic, Mizrahi food, and we have gefilte fish.
Wait,
Go figure.
yes, I like mine.
It's cat food. Come on. It just happens to be that we got used to it and we made it a delicacy. It's the truth. It's cat food, you know. Meow. It's all right. Little Friskies. It's all right. It's all right. It's all right. You know. It's all right. Little Friskies. It's good for you. It reminds you of we crossed the Red Sea. Meow. That's how it, you know. We borrowed heavily from the cultures amid which we lived. We always have done that. And we've contributed to those cultures. In this case, the rabbis borrowed the Greco-Roman symposium, washed it clean of its pagan origins, and installed instead the Passover Seder, the Passover story, and refigured all of the symbols. The 4 cups are not simply 4 cups to mark the stages of the journey of the philosophical discussion. They become representative of God's 4 promises. Problem is, in the Torah, God makes 5 promises. So you have to add an extra cup to the table. Now, what the hell are you going to do with an extra cup on the table? That'll be the cup of Elijah. But that really wasn't the cup of Elijah. That was the 5th promise that you had to put on the table, right? The haroset becomes mortar. It doesn't look like mortar. It looks like haroset, right? The karpas is the springtime. I mean, all of these kinds of things. So we do this traditionally. We turn things that we borrowed into Jewish indigenous symbols, and that's what we did with the Seder, okay? So let's take a moment and do some very practical work together. This is very practical. For all of you who are leading Seders, these are my 10 quick tips to a great Seder, all right? I apologize if you've heard this before, but I only know a few things, and this one I know. All right, here are some ways of making a Seder great. Number 1, set a time limit. I learned this from my brother-in-law, Rick. My brother-in-law, Rick, comes to the Seder, and he gets very anxious. And it took me a long time to realize why he got very anxious. And one year I got impatient with him. So I grabbed a kitchen timer, turned it to 1 hour, stuck it in front of him and said, Ricky, when this dings, you eat. He became very happy. No, and I realized why. Because I've studied this stuff, I know that the Seder comes to an end at some point. He, who doesn't have my level of literacy, thinks it goes on forever. As long as he knows it's not going to go on forever, it's going to have a terminus, and we're going to have dinner, he becomes much more calm. So take a kitchen timer, turn it to whatever time you think you need, put it down on the table, and say to everybody there, it dings, we eat. It works, I'm telling you. You can do a very fine Seder from the very beginning till dinner in 1 hour. Right? You really can. Trust me, I do this. If you have an impatient family, do it in 45 minutes. If your family's a little more, easygoing, take an hour and a quarter. Right? But as long as it has a terminus, ad quo, a terminus, everyone will be much happier. Number 2, remember that the purpose of the Seder is not to get through the Seder. The purpose of the Seder is to tell a story. Many of us have memories of an uncle or a grandfather who led a Seder like that, right? That's not what it's for. There's no virtue in that. The purpose is vehigadata lebincha bayom hahu. You will tell your child in that day. It's all about the telling. So tell the story. Tell it in any language, in any idiom, in any way that you need to tell it. Tell it according to the way of the people who sit at your table. When my kids were small, we made finger puppets. Now we have the same finger puppets, a lot more fun. It's like, let my people go. No. It's really funny. But the purpose of it is to create an idiom in which you can tell the story. As the kids got older, we used other kinds of things. One year, I did a whole Seder based on Schindler's List. It was a very powerful movie, and in many ways, it's a very good Pesach story. But the idea of a man caught between two worlds who has to grow a soul in the course of dealing with evil and escape from evil. This is a lot of, but it worked with my kids. One year I told all the teenagers at my table, bring me music lyrics that reflect the themes of slavery and freedom. Who knew that there was a gentleman named Kanye West who was a closet Jew? Did you know that? I didn't know that either. Apparently he's married to Kim Kardashian, so not all could be bad in his life. But and he lives in this neighborhood, by the way, because we met him once in the theater over here. Some of his lyrics, the kids really resonated to his lyrics about slavery and freedom. But you use the idiom of the people sitting in front of you. Don't depend on the Haggadah to give that to you. You might have to do it yourself. Because most Haggadahs were written for 3rd century rabbis. And unless you've invited some 3rd century rabbis to your table, it's going to be very hard to have a conversation. The other thing you need to do, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes, is find yourself in the story. Find yourself in the story means at some point stop the Seder and ask the question, to what are we enslaved today? Or if you want to be more sophisticated, what ideas enslave us? What ideas have enslaved us over the centuries, over the generations? What ideas enslave us now? What ideas do we need to be liberated from? Okay? And you can think of some interesting ideas. I mean, one of the great ideas of American culture is that black people aren't fully human. And that idea enslaved us as a culture. Okay? There's an idea in our culture that poor people don't have as much intrinsic value as rich people. Okay? There's an idea that success means how many toys you own. These are all very important ideas in American culture that I would maintain enslave us. Right? Here's an idea. If you don't look like the Barbie doll, you're not a worthy woman. Women are judged by the quality of their bust size. I mean, if you just think, these are ideas that enslave us, and talk about how we liberate ourselves from enslaving ideas. If you have people at the table who have personal stories of slavery and freedom, ask them to tell their stories. My wife and my daughter both worked at Beit Tshuva for some time, so we would invite people from Beit Tshuva to our Seder, and they would tell their stories about heroin, how they got enslaved to drugs, and how they found their freedom from that. So these are important ways to make the story vivid, which is what it's all about. Okay? Number 3. Now we're going to get very practical. Ready? Early in the Seder, it's like the 3rd thing we do. Kadesh Urachatz, karpas. The 3rd thing you do is something called karpas, the green vegetable eaten in celebration of springtime. For some reason, we use parsley. I don't know whose idea that was. The only people who really eat parsley are people who eat at Denny's at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I don't think that needs to be you. The purpose of karpas is to have a salad. The purpose of the salad is to cut your hunger so that you can enjoy the conversation at the Seder table for the next hour or so without fetching that you're hungry. So instead of just doing parsley, make a big tray of crunchy green vegetables. Get peppers and carrots and artichoke hearts and boiled potatoes and if you want parsley, gesundheit, get parsley, And why do we dip in salt water? For the tears of the slaves. Nonsense. Salt water was poor man's salad dressing. It was the only salad dressing you can afford when we were poor. You can probably afford better. I use guacamole. I think guacamole is something the Jewish people should adopt, right? I'll just have to think of a good Hebrew word for guacamole, right? Ranch dressing, Passover, kosher Pesach. But have dipping things. Now, if you have a big tray of crunchy vegetables with lots of things to dip in, people have something to munch on during the Seder. They don't get impatient. Isn't that an interesting idea? That'll save you a lot of tzuras. The other thing, of course, is when you get to that point in the Seder, you're talking about Chag HaAviv, the holiday of the springtime. Springtime means renewal. So go around the table and ask everybody to say one thing that's new in your life since last Pesach. Little kids will talk about being in the 5th grade. Other people will talk about a new career or retiring from a career, right? Other people will talk about an idea that they adopted. or a cause that became theirs, or an accomplishment that came their way. And celebrate something new. Sorry? Alavai, a grandchild. You hear that, kids? I'm waiting. I invested in your education. I prayed for you. Right? And that would be nice, right? Okay, good. That's number 2. Number 4, you're not going to believe me when I tell you this, but so I'll tell it to you as strongly as I possibly can. I am an ordained rabbi. I graduated from the Jewish Theological Seminary of America on Mother's Day in May of 1981. Okay? I have a doctorate in Jewish studies. Listen carefully. Nowhere in the corpus of any of the Jewish tradition are you commanded to drink sickeningly sweet Manischewitz wine. Nowhere, nowhere, nowhere. The only reason we drink Manischewitz wine is very simple. We came to the Lower East Side of New York as immigrants. The only grapes that grow in New York State are Concord grapes. Concord grapes are these horribly bitter, sour grapes. The only way to make wine out of Concord grapes is to dump a ton of sugar in it. And that's what we drank because we couldn't afford anything better. You can afford better. You're supposed to drink 4 cups of wine at the Seder. Why? Because the Seder is marked by the wine cups, okay? The Seder begins with Kiddush. Kiddush sanctifies the day. It's the opening of the holiday. I'm saying that today is a holiday. Then you're going to tell the story of the Pesach. You're going to have the 4 questions. You're going to tell the story. You're going to sing Avadim Hayinu. You're going to do the plagues. You're going to cross the Red Sea. You're going to sing Dayenu. And as soon as you finish Dayenu, you're then going to lift your second cup of wine, which is the toast, basically. It's a cup of redemption. And the blessing that's said over that cup celebrates redemption. So the first cup is Kiddush, sanctifying the day. The second cup is Geulah, the cup of redemption. Then you're going to have matzah and maror, have dinner. And after dinner, you're going to give thanks for the dinner. You're going to have Birkat HaMazon. And then you have a third cup, which is a cup of gratitude for all the blessings that have come our way. And then you're going to talk about Passover of the future. That's what the second half of the Seder is about. And at the very end of the Seder, the last cup is the cup of hope. So the 4 cups sort of mark the moments in the Seder, and they mark the turning points in the Seder. And I suggest you drink good wine. If you really want to be schnapsy about it, let the first one be an aperitif, the second one be a good white, the third be a nice red, and the fourth be a dessert wine. There is a tradition you're supposed to drink 4 full cups of wine, which means by the end of the Seder, nobody's sitting at the table. They're all sitting underneath the table. Just do me a favor and call Uber. Don't drive home after that, okay? But drink some nice wine. You can get some beautiful, even if you want to stick with the kosher wines, which I'll explain if anybody wants to know, there's some beautiful European, beautiful Israeli, beautiful California, beautiful Chilean, and Australian kosher wines now. Not expensive. You get really good ones. The best kosher wine in the world is the Yarden Cabernet Sauvignon. It's the Golan Heights winery where we were. It's a wonderful wine. It's about $25 a bottle, right? And it's a wonderful red. If you like a red, if you like a white, the Teal Lake Chablis is very, the Chardonnay. These are wonderful wines. So don't drink crappy wine, okay? Your kids will thank you for that. All right. Invite questions. In my Seder, what we do is anybody can stop the Seder at any time to ask any question they want. So what if we don't finish the Seder? So what? We don't finish the Seder, but we got good discussions all the way along. And we've had great discussions, theological discussions, political discussions. Right? I strongly suggest you don't talk about the president at your Seder table, or you'll never get done with the Seder. Right? But if you want to, you certainly can. Right? What's that? You're just going to talk about him? Well, then invite Stormy Daniels to your table. I think... Did you? The Kushner Haggadah, what's that?
Well, it's a parody on as if Kushner had a Haggadah, for example.
Oh, that Kushner. I thought there was another. I know some better Kushner. The Jared Kushner Haggadah? Yeah, this exists?
4 questions.
Yeah.
We're not answering any.
Yeah, fake news, right? Oh, you face me. I would suggest that you try to keep it to higher topics. So if that comes up, what I would suggest that you do is move it to higher topics. I honestly think this is important because it is newsworthy and it is timely and it's things that people are talking about. I think that what's more interesting, rather than just talk about him and his personality, is what this reflects about this moment in American democracy, which I think is very interesting. And I think on every side of it, I think that the forces that elected him are interesting about American democracy. People's sense of being alienated from their government, alienated from the elite, that the country is polarized between a leadership class and a sort of underclass. You know, if you're a mine worker in West Virginia or a factory worker in Michigan, you really do feel like those people on CNN don't know that I exist. And this was a protest. I think that there are some actually deeply profound things to talk about with regard to this, right? And so if you want to, what I would suggest you do is, if it starts that way, instead of just having either an argument about it from those who are pro or con, or just a bitch session about why we hate him, which is, you know, if you want that, turn on MSNBC. You know, instead of that, I think asking some of the deeper questions of what this means for American democracy is very important. I mean, I really think it's important. It's important kind of. There are some important issues that have been raised by this presidency. So that's my suggestion. We'll see if it works in my Seder. I'll tell you next week. Sing songs. The cantor sang some song with us. There's lots of them. My kids still love the Froggy song. You know, one morning when Pharaoh woke in his bed. And make up songs, bring songs. The songs are great. Use a good Haggadah. Most families still use the Maxwell House Haggadah. You know, good to the last trop. You know, but there's some really good Haggadot out there. If you're brave, what you do is get a bunch of different ones, and if people are smart enough to be able to follow it, so that people can read the commentaries and share various commentaries at the table, that's always a very nice thing to do. Yeah.
Any suggestions for Haggadah for young children?
There are some really good ones. If you go online, you can find some stuff that's there. All the nursery schools do really good stuff. The thing with kids is it's a very vivid holiday with really vivid symbols. So it's not a hard symbol to manage with young children.
I want to make it very different.
Yeah, but I wouldn't worry about a Haggadah with young kids. I would go get sock puppets or felt boards or things like that make, and I would get, you know, they have a thing now called Bag o' Plagues. Do you know what I'm talking about? Ping pong balls for hail and froggies, and, you know, we put little rubber froggies on every kid's plate and stuff like that. Yeah, I know. You should. I mean, there's all kinds of fun things to do. It's a very fun holiday for little kids. I mean, when I was a kid, this was the most memorable holiday, partly because it's just a great holiday, partly because my parents are my father's a baker. So first of all, it's the only week of the year he was home. And second of all, you know, it was really, if you imagine you're living in a baker's house, there's a certain amount of chumetz around, you know. So when we turned over the house for Pesach, I mean, we really turned over the house for Pesach. I think it's a great holiday for little kids.
Yeah, no, I do too.
Yeah, and for you have lots of little ones coming soon. Make the second night different. In Israel, they only have one night, so you do this once and you're done, which makes a lot of sense. In America and diaspora, we do 2 nights. So try to make the second night different than the first, not just a replay. One of the ways that you can do that is wherever you left off the first night, pick it up the second night. That's an easy way to do it. The other way to do it is to devote your second night to a theme. Pick a theme, like slavery, or pick a theme like the role of women in the story, which we're going to take a look at in a minute. Pick a theme and take a look at the Seder through a different lens the second night, so that you feel like the second night isn't just a replay. It's not just leftovers, okay? And that way the second night becomes kind of interesting. Get to the second half. I got to tell you that I was 17 years old before I discovered that the Seder didn't end when my father loosened his belt, complimented my mother, and fell asleep. Here's how it works. The first half of the Seder, which is everything until dinner, is about the Pesach La'avar, the Pesach that happened in Egypt. It's a history lesson. The second half of the Seder is about the Pesach La'atid, the Pesach that hasn't happened yet, the liberation of the world. It's all about dreams. It's messianic. It's all about messianic. Remember, the Seder ends with this goofy song called Chad Gadya, right? You all know that song? Chad Gadya, Chad Gadya. Now, by the way, just as an aside, if you do Chad Gadya, especially little kids, you do animal sounds, right? So who does a good goat? Gary, give me a goat. There you go. Chad Gadya, Chad Gadya. Bear. Then the cat comes and eats the goat. Give me the cat. There you go. And the dog. Give me the dog. See, here you go. You got it. Who let the dogs out? You know. By the time you get to the end, it's pretty hysterical. But you have to have had 4 cups of wine to do this right. I mean, then it becomes really hysterical. One year we had Congressman Sherman was here. It was before he got married, and he came to our Seder at the synagogue. And he was wearing this very severe black suit. And we got to the angel of death. And he raised his hand and said, I'll do that one. Right? And he stood there and said, I have a subpoena. You know? It was the best angel of death. You know? It was just fabulous. At the end of that song, right? So it's the father buys his kid a goat. The goat gets eaten by the cat gets bit by the dog gets whacked by the stick gets burned by the fire gets quenched by the water gets drunk by the ox gets slaughtered by the butcher gets taken down by the angel of death, and the last line of the song is Ve'ata Kodesh Baruch Hu V'shachat l'malcha mavis. God comes and destroys death. So the last line of the whole Seder is God destroys death. That's the messianic promise, right? That's the promise of a world to come. So the second half of the Seder is all about dreams. And the question that's asked is, what do you dream about? Where are we going? What are your aspirations? What are your hopes? It's the rebirth of hope. Because if the Seder, as I said, is about 2 moments in our history, slavery and liberation, the purpose of liberation is to tell you that hope is possible, that hope is not irrational. You saw liberation once, you can see it again. It's not irrational to hope for a better world. And that's what the second half of the Seder is all about. That's why you invite Eliyahu Hanavi into the room, right? Who is Elijah? Elijah is a prophet. According to the book of Kings, he never died. He went to heaven in a fiery chariot. And according to the prophet Malachi, who's the last prophet in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, Elijah will come back and bring with him the Messiah. He is the Messiah's announcer. The Messiah's Ed McMahon. The Messiah's a greeter. So inviting the Messiah into your inviting Eliyahu into your home is inviting the future into your home. Inviting Messiah into your home. It's all about hope. That's what the second half of the Seder is all about. Gary.
You know, we never did the second half of the Seder, as you said. We
Yeah.
also called.
Yeah.
I had so much wine at that point that we didn't do it. But one year, I heard a lecture that you gave on the second about just this.
Brilliant lecture, too, by the way.
And we had mostly adults at the Seder that year.
Yeah.
So I stopped the Seder and I played the lecture.
Oh, God.
It took about 20 minutes.
Yeah.
It's the only time in Passover Seder that I can recall where we had complete silence.
No kidding. Wow.
And I would recommend it. It's probably still on the website.
Somewhere there, I was smart. Yeah. 4 glasses of wine and anybody's brilliant. I have news for you, right? Thank you. So all of this tells you that you're spending a lot of time working on cleaning and cooking and inviting and getting ready. Spend a little time planning the experience. Seders are about experiences, and if the experience is well planned, then you can end up with something that's kind of memorable. Sometimes it's the spontaneous things that happen, the arguments, the questions, the cute things that happen. But often you plan an interesting Seder, interesting things kind of happen. Okay? Any questions? Yes, please. As I said, salt water is poor person's salad dressing. Salt water is the most salad dressing. So what happens is, as with so many things, what was once necessity becomes symbolic, right? So the tears of the slaves become the salt water. Yeah. So I'm going to dip into guacamole and remember our Latin American brothers and sisters. How's that? There you go, Jews. Or ranch dressing, Jews stuck on the ranch. I mean, We can figure this out. We can figure this out. As with so many, it's a symbolic language, and you turn everything in the Seder into some part of the symbolic language, right? So the haroset becomes mortar, and the matzah has, everything that's in the Seder is this. So let's talk about the structure of the Seder for just a second before we turn into some more philosophical things. So how did this get put together, okay? If you open the Mishnah, I didn't give you the Mishnah, but you trust me on this one. So in ancient times, you would make pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Pesach was the great pilgrimage festival. Wherever you lived in the world, you would make your way to Jerusalem. And during like the Second Temple period, we know from the historian Josephus that the population of Jerusalem was typically 10,000, but on Passover it was 110,000. Imagine what happens in a city when its population swells tenfold. So you couldn't get a hotel room, of course. Even now, it's hard to do. What you did was the populace would put tents up on the hills, and you would rent a tent. So here's the Dosick family coming from Encino, right? Or the Charnow family coming from Afghanistan, or your family coming from India, right? Or from France or from England. You'd leave in enough time to make the journey all the way to Eretz Yisrael. And if you can imagine the last leg of the journey, we all gather at the bottom of the hill and we walk up the hills of Judea. It takes about a day and a half to do that journey. The book of Psalms is full of Shir HaMa'alot, the songs of ascent. And you get to the city, and here's this city teeming with Jewish tourists from everywhere, right? And what we do is we rent a tent, and we go into the marketplace, and we buy all the things we need for our Pesach. We buy matzah and wine and maror and greens, right, and haroset. And then, it's just got to buy some souvenirs for the kids, chessboards and taluses and yarmulkes and little olive wood camels and junk. And then what you would do is you would go to the master of the house would go to the marketplace, and he'd buy a sheep, because you had to offer a sheep for Pesach, right? Pesach sheep. So Gary would go to the marketplace and pick out a really nice sheep for his family, but he wouldn't get it. He would pay for it, but he would get a chit. He'd get a ticket. Then he would go to the mikveh. There were these big, giant official mikvahs, and he would do his mikveh. He would bathe in the mikveh, take off his street clothes and put on white gown, and walk up to the Temple Mount. Now, the Temple Mount was divided into 3 courtyards. The first courtyard was called the courtyard of the Goyim, of the nations. So that was open to anybody. The second one was the courtyard of Israel, and the third was the courtyard of the Levites. So he would walk through the courtyard of the nations into the courtyard of the Israelites, and there he'd be met by a Levite. And the Levite would say, "Who are you?" And you'd say, "I'm Gary of the family Dosick of Northridge, California." And he'd say, "Gary, welcome. Give me your chit." He'd take the chit. He'd go get your sheep. They'd deliver you sheep. And you would stand in front of the altar, and he would say, "Who are you praying for this year?" And you would say, "My wife and my daughter and her husband and their children and my son. He should get married soon and become a famous recording artist, and friends in the community and patients that I've dealt with." And after you'd said all that, they would take the sheep and they would slaughter the sheep, clean it, which means they would take the inedible parts, burn them up on the altar. The blood would be spritzed on the bottom of the altar, and the meat of that sheep would be cooked, right? The priest would take, his cut, literally, and the rest he would wrap up in tin foil and hand to you in a takeout bag. Beit HaMikdash takeout bags, right? And then you would return up the hillside to your family who was waiting in the tent. And that's what dinner was. So anyone here ever eaten in a Moroccan or a Arabic or a Persian restaurant? Where do you sit? No, you don't sit on the floor. You sit on pillows, on cushions. That's the misubin thing. Now, in old days, I can demonstrate this to you. In old days, tables and chairs were not invented till the 15th century. People ate like this. Most people ate down like this. You sort of knelt, and you didn't have much food anyway, and you ate like this. But if you were rich, if you had time on your hands, you would lay on a pillow like you do in a Persian or an Arabic or a Moroccan restaurant, right? That's where this misubin business comes from. Because tonight we're all rich, because we're all free men, we're all free women. So we lay on the cushions, right? Now, in the Arabic, Moroccan, Persian restaurant, how is your meal served? A lady with an extraordinary belly button comes into the room with a very large hammered metal tray. On that tray is a big mound of grain. If it's an Arabic restaurant, it's rice. If it's Moroccan, it's couscous, right? And on top of that is the meat that you ordered, so the juices of the meat are flowing into the grain, and around it are condiments, okay? And that's put on the floor in front of you. How do you eat this mess? No. That's gauche. With bread. With bread, right. French bread in a Persian restaurant or Moroccan restaurant. It's baguette in a Moroccan restaurant. Pita in an Arabic restaurant. Lavash in a Turkish restaurant. You take a scooper of the bread. You take the grain. You take a chunk of the meat. You dip it in the condiment, and that's how you eat it. That's the Seder meal. Now watch what happens. In other words, let me put it this way. You all have a Seder plate. You know what I'm talking about? That plate you got for your wedding gift and has little 6 things on it? That was dinner. The Seder plate wasn't a plate of symbolic foods. The Seder plate was dinner. Dinner consisted of a grain with roast lamb and bitter condiments, sweet condiments, greens, salt water, right? That's dinner. Now, how do you eat this mess? You don't have pita tonight. You only have matzah. Now, in the old days, matzah wasn't what we call matzah. Matzah was probably closer to what we call a lavash or a tortilla. It was a flat bread that was flexible enough, right? But still, it was different than what we usually eat. The whole meal is different than we usually eat. So the child says, wait a minute. What's going on here? On all other nights, we eat with all different kinds of bread. Tonight, only flat bread. On all other nights, we eat all kinds of greens. Tonight, only bitter greens. On all other nights, we eat sitting up. Tonight, we're lying down. And then the fourth question, the original fourth question was, on all other nights, we eat all kinds of meat. Tonight, roast lamb. It was a custom to eat roast lamb Erev Pesach at the temple for the sacrifice. And then for the first 1,000 years after the destruction of the temple, it was customary in Jewish families to eat roast lamb on Erev Pesach as a memory of the temple. In the year 1100, the rabbis decided that that memory of the temple was becoming too acute and driving people crazy with their messianic aspirations and messianic dreams. They wanted to distance us from that kind of messianic stuff, so they took roast lamb off the menu. And now, except for certain small Sephardic groups, we eat anything except roast lamb. Chicken, brisket, salmon, whatever. But that's what dinner was. And the kid sees, on all other nights, we eat with this way. And all other nights, you tell me not to play with the food. Tonight, you're playing with the food. This dipping nonsense. You're playing with what's going on? And you say, I'm glad you asked. Remember these movies where the family is harboring a secret? And, you know, like they turn out to be Soviet spies or something. And when the kid reaches a certain age, they take them down to the basement. And let me tell you who we really are. There were all these movies like these 50s where turns out they're Soviet spies living in America. And then there was the Saturday Night Live people made a parody of that, the Coneheads, where at one point she says, who are we? And they take her down to the basement and they say, you know, like they take off their hats and they say, we're from Ramulak or whatever it's from, right? Remember this? Well, that's a sort of the drama of the Seder. Kid, we aren't who you think we are. We have a family history you don't know yet. What is our family history? We were slaves in the land of Egypt. What's it like to be a slave? Taste this. Oh my God, that's bitter. That's what it's like to be a slave. And God redeemed us there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Taste this. Oh, that's sweet. Yes, that's how it is. And here's the bread that our ancestors ate when they were slaves. And here's the beginning of our freedom. And here's the lamb of the Pesach, which reminds us of the lamb that protected us on the night of the last night. The Seder is an educational method of introducing the story. The Seder is also a reenactment of the last night in slavery. The last night in slavery. What's it like to be the last night? You were slaves. Your parents are slaves. Your grandparents are slaves. And you had no hope except that tomorrow your kid would have it a little easier than you did. And all of a sudden this fellow Moses shows up and says, pack your things, we're leaving tomorrow. First of all, would you believe him? Right, exactly right. So according to the tradition, there's an interesting line in the book of Exodus which says that Bnei Israel were chumashim. And what they and one of the, which means they were five, they were armed, or they were, one of the midrashim says only a fifth of them, only 20%, 1 in 5 believed him. Because you had to believe that you could be something else besides a slave. You had to take a chance, right? So the question is, would you believe him? And he said, pack your things, we're leaving tomorrow. So what's it like to be eating dinner in your house knowing that tomorrow you'll be leaving this house, leaving this land, leaving this status as a slave, never ever to return? What's it like? Scary, wonderful, all at the same time, right? I had a friend who did a Seder when I was in New York, and he said to us, wear traveling clothes. He sent us an invitation to the Seder that included airplane tickets. Remember the old days when they used to have airplane tickets? He got a batch of them. And your Seder invitation came in an airplane ticket. And he said, wear traveling clothes and bring a suitcase. And put in the suitcase what you would take out of Egypt. If you were leaving your home tonight, never to return, what would you put in the suitcase? And the first thing, we got to his house, we realized that what he meant us to do is to sit on our suitcases. There were no chairs. And I made a mistake. I brought a hard Samsonite, so it was not a pleasant Seder. But during the course of the Seder, you can do this, by the way, he had everybody open their suitcase and share the thing that they brought and why that would be the one thing they would take from their home. So some young woman had these wonderful candlesticks that her mother had given her, that her grandmother had smuggled from Europe. And somebody else had a picture of the family that they wanted to hold on to. And someone else had a book that was important to them. But the one artifact that represented your past as you're moving into a future, never to return to that past again, it's just an interesting exercise. To get into this spirit that tonight we're leaving, tomorrow we're gone. And that really is what the Seder is supposed to represent. That's what the Seder is supposed to feel like. It's a grand experience in constructed drama. And the meal is the stage, and the food is the props, and the Haggadah is the script, and you're the actor. And you're putting on a drama because you really want to give this memory to your children. Okay, let's stop there. Any questions so far? Are we good? Any questions, comments, counter sermons? Come on. Yes, please, Judy.
Where do you get these children's things that are the toys?
You could probably get them online. Where do you get the children's props and toys? I get the frogs from Oriental Trading Company, which is you can get it online. You can go. There's a little store called Oz right across the street, and they have rubber frogs. Shalom House has a lot of this stuff. That's the local Jewish outlet. At the Jewish outlet near you, at your synagogue gift store, except if it's been turned into a youth lounge and like an art show. Vons, yeah. And most of the supermarkets now have a huge selection of useless Passover food. So, yes, please. Tic-tac-toe. Oh, really? Passover frogs and matzah, tic-tac-toe. I like that. That's good. The frogs is such an interesting thing because kids have fun with it, but if you think about what it is, it's like, it's a really horribly invasive kind of thing, right? Yeah. Yeah, if you Google Passover toys, I'm sure you'll find everything you need. And you probably have enough time to get it if you have like Amazon Prime, That kind. You pay the extra $2 and they'll deliver it tomorrow, right? It would be interesting to go on Amazon and order 10 plagues, that sort of thing. All right, let's take another minute. You'll be okay so far? Everybody cool? Everybody, you got another 20 minutes? You're falling asleep. Okay, so I thought it would be interesting. Let's take the narrative story now, and I want to show you a couple of quick, interesting things about this, and then we'll call it a night. Okay? Turn to the second page for a moment, because this is just an interesting thing. So this is the 12th chapter of the book of Exodus. This is, in the course of the narrative of the book of Exodus, this is right before the last plague. Okay? So this is God speaking to Moses. Speak to the whole community of Israel and say that on the 10th of this month, that's Nisan, that's this month, okay? Each of them shall take a lamb to a family, a lamb to a household. You'll keep watch over it till the 14th day of the month. The 14th day of Nisan is a week from Friday, okay? And all the assembled congregation of Israel shall slaughter it at twilight. They shall take some of the blood and put it on the two doorposts and the lintel of the house in which they're to eat it. So first of all, this is an interesting thing, right? You're talking to the slaves. And what are you telling them to do? Mark their homes. So who's going to do this? The people who believe that Moses was real. So this is a question of which side are you on? Are you willing to come out of the closet and declare your resistance to the Pharaoh? It's one thing to be resistant to the Pharaoh quietly. It's another thing to put it on your doorpost and say, I'm one of those who is ready for redemption. And if you think about it, it's a gutsy thing to do, right? You're advertising your resistance to the government. And the government has a nasty habit of killing people, right? So this is a powerful thing. And if you think about the course of the story, in the course of the story, all the action is done by God and Moses. It's Moses confronting Pharaoh and God bringing plagues, and the people of Israel are just quiet bystanders to the story. This is the first time anything is asked of them. Are you willing to participate in your own redemption? Or are you hoping that someone's going to come along and do it for you? Are you willing to take a chance? And the idea that you're willing to take a chance for freedom is a very gutsy thing to do, right? I mean, the Nazis made us put on yellow stars so they knew who we were, right? In a certain way, this is what this is. This is a red flag on your house. Because if this redemption doesn't happen, if God doesn't show up, right? If the angel of destruction doesn't come tonight and destroy the Egyptians, you're going to wake up in the morning with a big red flag over your house saying, you hate the Pharaoh. You understand how gutsy this is? Yes, please.
Well, if you read another few lines.
I'm coming.
It's not quite so gutsy.
What?
It's not quite so gutsy.
No,
You don't do that.
Well, we're coming to that. Wait. Right. They shall take some of the blood and put it on the doorpost, the lintel of the house, and eat it. They shall eat the flesh that same night. They shall eat it roasted over fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Does that strike anybody as interesting? No. Think for a minute. Before they left, they're eating matzah and maror.
Right, that means they're baking matzah not because they have no time.
Azoy. They're not baking matzah because they don't have time. They're baking matzah because that's what slaves eat. Or that's what they're being told to eat. And why bitter herbs that first night? And you're not told why, by the way. So if you're a historian, the way you read this is you say that the later custom got retrojected back into the actual history. Right? Why do we have turkey on Thanksgiving? Because our pilgrim ancestors ate turkey at Plymouth Rock. Did they eat turkey at Plymouth Rock? Probably not. But it's okay. That's, But you see, it's a backwards thought, because if matzah represents the bread of redemption and bitter herbs represent the slavery, you would not. So what really happened is you had a custom. Here's what you really have, and this is sort of controversial. You had a custom of eating flat bread at this time of year, and bitter herbs at this time of year, and roast lamb at this time of year, because this was part of the festival of the new lambs. This was an agricultural festival that the Jewish tradition borrowed and created out of it Passover. They borrowed what was already a custom and created out of it a Passover, right? And that's why you have this stuff before we even left. Carol? Well, that's a really interesting question. Probably, did all the slave families have a lamb? Lamb's a very expensive thing to have. Even now, by the way. I don't know if you've gotten lamb chops lately, but you have to trade your firstborn and your car for a couple of lamb chops. I mean, It's what you're doing is it's an imaginary retrospection, a retrojection, pushing backwards the custom of the holiday back to the history when it really happened, right? Remember there was a comedy record by Stan Freberg called The United States of America, and it was full of these kinds of things. Columbus lands in America, and the Indians welcome him. And he says, listen, I have to cash a check. I have no cash with me. And they say, we're sorry, the banks are closed. He said, why are the banks closed? Well, it's Columbus Day, you know. In a certain way, that's the joke here, too. You're eating matzah, maror, and roast lamb before you leave Egypt. You see, because you're having Pesach before you leave. You get it? So this is because what you're trying to do is to remind yourself that the Seder is a representation of the last meal that we were slaves. Right? This is how you'll eat it. Your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, your staff in your hand. You'll eat it hurriedly. See, it's interesting. We eat it the opposite. We eat it slowly, but they ate it in a hurry. It is the Passover offering to the Lord. For that night I will go through the land of Egypt, strike down every firstborn of Egypt, man and beast, and I'll mete out punishment to all the gods of Egypt. And the blood on the houses where you're staying shall be a sign for you. When I see it, I will pass over you, so that no plague will destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. So in my Seder, of course, when we get to this story, my brother, there are 4 sons. I'm the wise one. That's right. He raises his hand and he says, if Santa Claus knows if you've been sleeping and knows if you're awake, knows if you've been good or bad, or be good for goodness sake, how come the angel of death of God doesn't know the same thing? Why does the angel of death need blood on the lintel to protect you? Doesn't he have the same intelligence information that Santa Claus has? Right? And the Midrash asks this question also and says a very interesting thing, that once you unleash destruction, it's very hard to control it, because there's always collateral damage. It's a very interesting observation about this. Yes, please.
Okay, so I want to go back to your earlier point.
I'm having fun. Go ahead.
The guts to put the blood on the...
Don't you think so? Because, see, if you're a slave, it took a lot of guts to put the stuff on the blood on the lintel.
Your firstborn is going to die if you don't do that.
Well, that's the gamble. That's the gamble, Your Honor. The gamble is, see, we know the end of the story. Knowing the end of the story makes telling the story a hell of a lot easier. Right? I'm very serious, right? Let's take another example just for a moment. The American Revolution. We celebrate July 4th. You know, you remember what Benjamin Franklin said when he signed the Declaration of Independence? He says, we're either going to hang separately or hang together. You know, the guys who wrote the Declaration of Independence were signing their death certificate, because had they lost the revolution, the king's army would have come and hunted each one of them down and hung them as traitors. Now, it's easy now to say, well, you were signing the Declaration of Independence in the United States of America, because we think of America in a very different way. You were signing a declaration offensive to the king of the most powerful military force in the world. The king's navy controlled the world. It's easy to think now, oh, they were patriots, John Hancock, right? What a gutsy thing to do. This is the same thing. This is your Declaration of Independence. You don't know if this guy Moses is on the level. Is the angel of death really going to come around?
Then I have a terrible consequence if he is right, if he really is speaking for God.
Right.
That's different if I don't have anything. I can pass.
Here's the gamble. If you believe him, if you believe him, you're going to offend the Pharaoh, but he'll protect you. And if you don't believe him, and you offend God, you can lose your kid. And you don't know which it is. And you're a slave. So you're not exactly in a position for good discretionary decisions, because you're used to taking orders. And you're not only defying a visible king for an invisible God. I just want you to gather in the gutsiness of this thing. Well, that's what the whole point of it was. That God says at the beginning of the narrative, which is here someplace, which is the reason I'm going to do these 10 plagues is so you'll understand that I'm here. But even after 10 plagues, even after 9 plagues, the idea that you're going to advertise, because the plagues didn't demand anything of you. You're going to put blood on the lintel and everyone's going to know. And if you wake up in the morning and there was no angel of death, Pharaoh's soldiers are going to know where you live. And they will kill your firstborn. Right? Yeah, I mean, you understand how, I just want you to gather in this. This is for a slave, this is a gutsy move, right? You know? Tell the Nazis where you're living, you know? Yeah, I mean, you see what's going on here? It's a tremendous moment. And now sit and have this meal. Sit and have this meal knowing there's blood on your lintel and not knowing what you're going to wake up to in the morning. Now tell me about that dinner. Okay? No, seriously. Your family's gathered around you and you're responsible for your kids and you're powerless to protect them because you're a slave. You're not a soldier. And you have no weapons. Right? So this is how this goes. Right? So if you go a little, where am I now? Right? Number 14. Look at verse 14, right? This day shall be to you one of remembrance. You shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord through the ages. You'll celebrate as an institution for all time. 7 days you'll eat unleavened bread. On the first day you'll remove leaven from your house. For whoever eats unleavened bread the first day of the seventh, that person will be cut off. So this leaven business was another ancient custom that was assimilated into Pesach. What does not eating leaven have to do with the exodus from Egypt? I mean, think about it. It was an old custom of cleaning out, spring cleaning, of cleaning out the household. And leaven's an interesting thing. First of all, the people who invented leavening were the Egyptians. They're the people who they're the ones who discovered yeast. They invented leavened bread, and they also invented beer. Because if you can ferment bread, you can ferment barley, right? So this is Egyptian. You're cleaning out basically the Egyptness of your house. Okay? You're cleaning that out because you're going to represent, that's the connection, but it's a very oblique connection. It's much more likely that there was another holiday which demanded no leaven for a week, and we assimilated that holiday into our celebration of Pesach. So we assimilated the holiday of flat bread, no leaven, bitter herbs. All these symbols were existent at the time as springtime festivals, and we made them ours. We made them ours. The Christians did the same thing, just incidentally. What do bunnies and chicks have to do with the crucified Christ? And chocolate bunnies especially. I mean, and the answer is that when the Christian community, for the first 300 years, celebrated the Easter, they celebrated it with matzah and maror. It was called Pesach. In the 3rd century, at the Council of Nicaea, when the Christian church began to formulate their ideology, they wanted to separate from Judaism. They moved Shabbos from Saturday to Sunday, right? And they moved Pesach. They took Easter out of Pesach and made it Easter. Easter is the name. Easter is Esther, is Ishtar, the name of the Canaanite fertility goddess. And they took the Roman fertility festival of the springtime and turned its symbols into the symbols of Easter. Bunnies, chicks, eggs, these are all fertility symbols that belong to the Easter, to the springtime festival that was celebrated among Roman families. And the Christians simply borrowed them all or stole them and made them into symbols of Easter. Because and assimilated the notion of the risen Christ as a symbol of life over death. Well, we did the same thing. We borrowed all these ancient Near Eastern festival symbols and made them part of our Pesach. Does that make sense? Right? Okay, let's keep going. Where am I? No, you cut off Israel. You will celebrate a sacred occasion on the first day and the 7th day. No work shall be done. You'll observe the feast of unleavened bread. For on this day I brought your ranks out of the land of Egypt. You'll observe it all times in the 1st of the 14th month, etc. Go down to Moses, summon the Israelites, the elders of Israel. Go pick out a lamb for your family. Slaughter the Passover offering. Now, wait a minute. If he says to them, slaughter the Passover offering, they don't know what a Passover offering is. Passover hasn't happened yet. That line only makes sense if they understand what a Passover offering is, that it somehow existed before. Or else it's like saying to Columbus, you can't cash a check because it's Columbus Day. You see what's going on?
Well, I think what's going on
is a mishmash. Yes, right.
Is saying, look, pay attention because you're going to celebrate this holiday forever.
Right.
So this is how you're going to do it.
Right.
But it's also.
And I want you to know that this is what your ancestors did in Egypt. You're reproducing their moment, even though it's anachronistic. Right? Take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood, apply some to the basin, the lintel, the two doorposts. Go outside the door this morning. Now, none of you shall go outside the door of his house until morning. For when the Lord goes through to smite the Egyptians, he will see the blood on the lintel and the two doorposts. The Lord will pass over the door and not let the destroyer enter and smite your home. You shall observe this as an institution for all time. Now listen to the next line. And when you enter the land that the Lord will give you and he's promised, you'll observe this rite. So even when you're not a slave anymore, even when you have your own freedom, even when you have your own land, even when you live in Northridge, you're going to do this. I want to see blood on your lintel, Dosick. No, I'm kidding. Don't do that. You'll scare the hell out of your neighbors. That would be something. I mean, Channel 7 would be at your door. I would say that. Right? And when your children ask you, what do you mean by this rite? Did anybody recognize that? When your children ask you, why are you doing this? Which son is that? The wicked son. Mazel lachem. Does that wicked here? No, that was a later midrash. Here it's an honest question. We live in Northridge. Why are you putting blood on the lintel? We live in freedom. Why do we have to sit and remember we were slaves? Why do we have to remember we were slaves if we're now free? And the added piece of this is that calling yourself a slave was the worst thing you could do. That was a shame. That was a shameful legacy to pass to your children. Everyone wants to think that their ancestors were noble. Nobody wants to think that their ancestors were schleppers, right? Whenever I ask American Jews, like, tell me about your ancestors who came from America. Oh, my great-grandfather was a very Orthodox rabbi, very, very frum, very pious, and he came to this country. Your grandfather wasn't an Orthodox rabbi. If your grandfather was an Orthodox rabbi, he stayed in Europe. The really pious ones stayed in Europe. The ones who came here were the schleppers. My ancestors were horse thieves, card players, pickpockets. I'm proud of that. But that's what it means to say my ancestors were slaves. That's like whenever they have one of these silly shows and the guy does past life regressions. You ever watch this? He puts his hand on your head. He says, oh, my God, in a past life, you were Marie Antoinette, right? In a past life, you were Napoleon. Nobody was ever Napoleon's butler, right? Or Napoleon's horse, you know. No one was ever Napoleon's schlepper. You know, everybody was Napoleon, right? Because you want to think that, you know, if I come from, but to say you were a slave. So when your kid says to you, what do you mean we were slaves? Look who we are now. And that answer is yes. The difference between where you were and where you are is a God of history. That's the entire purpose of the holiday. The purpose is to understand that from what you came, from where we came to where we are, is not only your own doing, but providence. That's a gift of the God of history. So you will say to, when your child says, what do you mean by this rite? You will say to him, it is the Passover sacrifice of the Lord, because he passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt when he smote the Egyptians, but he saved our houses. And then it says in the middle of the night, it actually came to be. So this is the origin of the holiday. From the very beginning, the idea was create a dramatic moment. So your child will ask a question. And the question is, how did we get here? Who were we? Who are we? And how does slavery change us? How does that experience of slavery change the way we see the world? And how does the experience of liberation change us? And that's from the very, very beginning how the holiday was structured. Any last questions, concerns, counter sermons? Anyone have a great custom that they do in their house we can all steal?
Remembering that also keeps us humble. So if you have, you well off now, your kid doesn't think that everything's coming to him. Hey, look, we got here because of this.
Yeah.
So don't be such a wise man. Think everything's coming to you.
It's a very important idea.
especially because you're now into your sixth generation of American settlement. And kids simply don't understand that the freedom and security and prosperity that they experience aren't somehow built into the universe. And when you tell them, you know, one of the things we did at our table is we asked our older relatives to tell the story of how they came to America. You know, and my Aunt Sarah would tell the story about coming as a little girl and settling on the Lower East Side, and she was a union organizer on the Lower East Side. A tough little lady. And what it was like to unionize workers so that they would get a wage that would be livable. And my kids never heard these. I mean, the stories were remarkable, you know. What the Great Depression was like. My mother used to talk about being evicted from, as a little girl, they were evicted from their house in Brooklyn. And that really, she came home from school to find all the family's furniture sitting on the sidewalk. Kids don't understand this. I mean, they have no sense of this. So where we came from and how we got here is not built into the universe. This was a great gift. It's not an entitlement. It's a great gift. And it has to be taught. Right.
Why did they go for this good question of why all this, and later on he's the wicked stuff?
Yeah. Well, so you have the Midrash of the four sons. It's a Midrash. 4 times in the Bible, in the Torah, you're told, tell your kid the story of Pesach. 4 times. So whenever there's a repetition of something, the rabbis of the Talmud would ask, why did I need 4 of these to tell me this? So what they do is they say what it recognizes is that there are different kinds of people sitting at the table. Different kinds of children, different kinds of personalities, right? And you're supposed to tell the story to each of them in the way that they need to hear it. So the first one is the Chacham, and he asks, what are all the laws and traditions of the Pesach? So he's asking the technical question. You explain to him all the laws. He's the plugged-in one. He's already asking the how question. That's why we make him the Chacham and we exalt him, because we like how questions. They're much easier to ask than why questions. This kid asks, I think, the best question of the whole Seder. Why? Why are you doing this? What does this narrative mean to you? Where does it fit where does your personal narrative plug into this larger, grand narrative? And he's interpreted in the Torah, in the Midrash, as a cynic, right? Because he says, lachem, which means had he been there, he wouldn't have been one of those who came out. He wouldn't have believed Moses. He pushes off to the other, the hope. He looks down upon hope. So he represents, and it's just a construction of the grammar of the sentence. It's not in the original text. The idea of how do you talk to a cynic? How do you talk to one who just doesn't believe that hope is real? And your answer is, I wanted to give you my personal witness. Ba'avur zeh shasali. It happened to me. And I believe in redemption because I was there and I saw it. Okay? Then the third one is the tam. He says, mazeh, what's going on? And he's a simple one. Now you can look at him in 2 ways, either positive or negative. Positive, he's simple, he's open. He's just a simple-minded person, and he's just wondering what's going on. Or if you want to look at it in a more negative way, he's oblivious. All of this is happening around him, and he doesn't even notice that something's different tonight. You know, he's sort of the oblivious one. He's oblivious to the world around him. And to him, you have to tell him the story so he understands, yes, there is evil in the world, and we know that because we were its victims. And yes, there is liberation in the world, and we know that because we were its witness. And those are the 2 facts of the story. And then the last one is the silent one. It just says, tell him the story. And he's silent, and you can interpret his silence in many ways. It could be a cynical silence. It could be a resigned silence. It can be a naive silence, right? And him you have to just draw in and say, come in and let me tell you a story. Let me tell you who we are. And that you bring him in. That's the idea. Okay? That's how the Midrash is constructed. It's an interesting phrase, put his teeth on edge. I mean, what does that mean, put his teeth on edge? Well, yeah, it could be. You know, but you see, there's another way to think about it. In the Ve'ahavta, you have the phrase, V'shinantam livanecha. Shinantam, the word shinan means to teach, but it's related to shinayim, teeth. So it really doesn't mean whack him, it means teach him. Get to him. Find a way to get to him. He's smart. He's wise. And he's really asking the best question of the night. Why does this matter to us? And the answer is because I know the way of the world because of this story. I know there's evil on the one hand, and I know there's the possibility of redemption on the other hand. And those are the two elements of Jewishness. To recognize evil and to know that it calls on me, it claims me, and to recognize redemption and to know that it's possible. The world is not stuck in its current condition. It contains the possibilities of its own redemption. Those are the two facts of the story that you're supposed to share with that kid, right? Well, never again. You add the whole element of the Holocaust, and it makes it even more complicated because it's very hard then to talk about a God of history, as we said at the beginning. Where's the redemption there? Maybe the redemption is the fact that we survived, but the fact that you lost so much and so many is still such a bitter taste, Yeah. Yeah, well, so again, Schulweis and those theologians would say that the answer is that the God of history is in your hands. It becomes a God of personal responsibility. That's how you interpret the God of history at a moment when you can't think of a God as an outsider to history. We become the agents of that God. Yeah, and the idea of I'm going to put blood on lintel, symbolically to say I'm going to stand up for that which matters to me, which is a big deal. It's a commitment. It's a commitment. That's a nice way to put it. You have to make a choice. That's what he likes to refer to. You have to make a choice. Who are you going to believe? Which side are you going to be on? Right? There's this moment in Schindler's List, which my kids and we always look at this time of year because it matches the moment in Moses' life. In Moses' life, there's this moment when he steps out of the palace and he sees the slaves. And he has to make a decision who he is and where he belongs. Does he belong in the palace or does he belong with the slaves? And there's a moment in Schindler's List, and you all remember this because it's very vivid. It's when he's gallivanting with this beautiful young woman. He's married, but that doesn't matter. He's gallivanting with this beautiful young woman, and they're on a picnic, and they're overlooking the liquidation of the ghetto. And he stops and he watches all the children running to escape from the Nazis, and his eye catches the little girl in the red coat. And he's watching this little girl run and try to get away. And you realize that at that moment, something is changing in Oskar Schindler. He's no longer the son of a bitch he was before. At the beginning of the movie, remember, the beginning of the movie is they're dispossessing a family from an apartment so he can live there. They kick a family out of their home so he can live there. At the beginning of the movie, he's bribing the Nazi officials with booze and with delicacies so he can do business with them. He's a real bad guy at the beginning. And the whole movie really, Spielberg does this beautifully, is Oskar Schindler grows a soul. Oskar Schindler grows a soul, and he becomes a champion of life, not death. And the same thing happens to Moses in the course of the story. Moses could easily be the palace guy and never step out. But slowly he grows a sensibility, a soul. And the question is, how does a man grow a soul? How does a human being grow a soul, a sense of personal responsibility? Right? And then there's that wonderful scene at the end of the movie. And for this, Ben Kingsley should have won the Academy Award. But the guy is such a good actor that you forget that he's acting. That's how good an actor he is. He plays Stern, the accountant, remember? Right? And he says to Schindler, there's this family, the Perlmans, and they need to get on the list. Because if we don't get them on the list, they're going to die. And the daughter is there begging him, please put them on the list. And Schindler gets all angry and says, don't you understand what this means, what the Nazis are going to do to me when they catch me? And don't you understand how terrible this is? And get out of my face, and who needs these Jews anyway? And let them all die, and I can't. And you hear this tantrum. And he's putting on his hat, and he's putting on his coat, and he's screaming about these damn Jews. And why don't you get out of my face, and who needs you anyway? And as he walks through the door, he turns back to Stern and says, put him on the list. Bam! The door closes, and you realize the man is a human being now, right? The question is, where in the Pesach story, and I gave it to you on the first page, we didn't get a chance to do it this year, where does Moses grow his soul? At what point do you say Moses becomes one of us? He's no longer the palace guy, but now he becomes the liberator. At one particular point, you get a sense of the slamming door, put him on the list. You get a sense of Moses turning in the same way. Right? Turning in the same way. So the story is as much a story of the liberation of Moses And it's a story of liberation of the whole people. How does a human being say, I'm responsible? I'm responsible. I'll take the risk to be responsible. Yeah, that's what the Moses story is all about as well. Everybody have a happy, healthy Pesach. Shana Tova. Take good care. Thanks for being here tonight. Take care. Be really careful.